Okay. Our learning today is dedicated to the Refuah Shlema of Michal Shalom Chaim ben Braina Ita. Shav Refuah Shlema. Okay, we are in the first chapter of Shaar Hayichud v'Amunah. I don't know how to exactly identify what we're up to. It's the words V'chein b'chol habriyim. It's about 10 lines down or 12 lines down in the standard print of the Tanya. And if you have a different print, it's probably on a different page. But hopefully you can find it. Essentially, the Alter Rebbe here has quoted this statement that he attributes to the Baal Shem Tov, although it's originally in the Medrash Tehillim, that tells us that Hashem has not only created the world back in 5,782 years ago, but that Hashem is in constant creation of the world, which underscores the idea that the world has no innate reality. And as we describe this, our objective is to reach a perspective that is best described as godliness is assumed and the world is a stunning innovation. In Hebrew, we read that as elokus, godliness, bipshitis, that's the obvious thing. Vibria and creation, that's the hischachis, that's the remarkable thing. So rather than a position where we say, I exist. Now, does God exist? Do I recognize God? Does God have a place in my life? Or this is my world, and what does God have to add to it? Does God bring meaning, purpose, joy, and happiness to my life? And if so, God is thus validated. We turn this around into a different, I guess it's 180-degree different perspective that says God exists. Now, the question is whether or not I exist. We talk about this in so many different contexts in our sort of spiritual, social perspective, where we begin with the premise that God created us out of dust. So I have to spend my life trying to validate whether or not I really exist. So there's essentially two different ways that we could go about that. One is we accumulate more dust, essentially more things, or we can be in service of something greater than ourselves. There's a story about a man who asked the Rebbe Rashab, how do we know that we really exist? Maybe we don't even really exist, meaning he's taking it to a whole nother extreme. Maybe we don't exist at all. So the Rebbe Rashab explained, well, we know that we exist because if a person were to merely pantomime chopping wood on Shabbos, he would not be in violation of the prohibition of chopping wood on Shabbos. Whereas if he actually chops wood on Shabbos, he would. So the message being that since we can do something that will have an impact on Hashem, hopefully in the positive, that is, we can serve Hashem, the whole concept of dir b'tachteinim, that affirms our own existence because Hashem certainly exists. And therefore, my capacity to be in the service of Hashem, to do something for Hashem, is evidence that I exist. Because if I didn't exist, I couldn't serve Hashem. If I don't serve Hashem, then in essence, I don't exist. And we've used many different metaphors, and we'll see some other illustrations of it as we move forward to help us understand what, in fact, is our perspective of our own existence. Because remember, the ultimate theological question that we run into, or as I've seen it called, the theosophical, which sounds a lot more impressive, though I'm not sure what it means, issue that we run into is, if God exists and God is infinite, then how can I exist? Because if I take up space, does that mean that I'm crowding out Hashem? Or alternatively, if I exist, then how could God be infinite? Does my existence push back against God's infinity? So how do we blend the two together? And our ultimate answer, as you can anticipate, of course, is the tzimtzum process, that we exist within the infinity of Hashem, as we will hopefully manifest. So we have said that if Hashem is not continuously giving creation its existence, it would stop existing. It has no independent existence. Even the spiritual entities that would appear to have so much of their own importance and so on. So here we go. V'chein, b'chol habruyim, so too in all creations. I hope everybody can find the spot. If you have the lessons in Tanya or an English Tanya or Hebrew Tanya or whichever the different prints of Tanya that we have, I hope everybody can find it. V'chein b'chol habruyim, so too in all creations. Sheb'chol oilemus, in all of the worlds. And again, remember the word worlds means stages of awareness. El yoinim, those that are a very high level stage of awareness. V'tachteinim, and those that are a very low or clouded level of awareness. That is, even the angels, which we might suppose, for example, people have probably heard this argument. Why would God care about what I do? Why would God care about what I eat, or if the clothes I wear have wool or wool and linen, or if I eat meat, or if I eat milk, or if I eat meat and milk together? So the pushback that we would have is, well, what then do you presume that God cares about? Well, God cares about the big things. He cares about the galaxies and so on. Why? What is the flaw in this logic? Because we are projecting our limited capacity on Hashem, meaning if I was God, that's what I would care about. Why? Because I have limited capacity. So I'll pay attention to the big things. I can't even count the amount of grass blades in my own lawn. How could I expect that God can be aware and giving constant nourishment to every single blade of grass in the entire world? And the response is, well, that's the difference between being big and being infinite. If God were only big, he'd care about big things. But by being infinite, there is no concept of big and small. So higher and lower are more naturally aware of godliness or more naturally aligned with godliness. Angels and spiritual entities, in contrast to ordinary persons, is a scale that's relevant to us, because we can see a difference, we perceive a difference between big and small, greater awareness, lesser awareness. Hashem is, of course, not shackled by such distinction. Hashem is not restrained by a difference between big and small, greater awareness and lesser awareness. And as such, it's irrelevant. They are all absolutely dependent on Hashem's continuous nourishment. Okay, we're in chapter 1 still. I don't know if somebody can point out where it is. Yeah, Mrs. Saletta, if you could unmute yourself, please, and tell us.
We're at the bottom. If you have the lessons in Tana, at the bottom of 838, page 838, at the bottom.
Okay, hopefully you could find that. And again, the Hebrew line that we just read reads, V'chein b'chol habruyim, which translates as so too by all creations, or something along those lines. They are all continuously dependent on Hashem's constant nourishment. I mean, it's like a thought. If I have a thought in my head and I think about it, it's there. If I stop thinking about it, it stops being there. And we talk about this, that God created worlds and then he destroyed worlds, or came up with ideas and he scrapped those ideas. So did they ever exist? Well, they existed in Hashem's consciousness. We talked about this even in relation to the publishing of Tanya, that the Alter Rebbe had the idea of publishing this section of the Tanya first. So even though he chose not to, there still retains a residual influence of that original idea. And again, similar as we have discussed. Vafilu eret halazu hagashmius, even this physical world, ubechinas doimei mamish, and even in the character or the category in this world of doimei. Now, the word doimei most literally translates as mute. We use it to refer to the mineral creation, sand, rock, dust, and so on, that are manifest, or their distinctive characteristic is that they have no sign of life, because even the next stage up, which is plant life, it grows. So the fact that something grows shows that there's a life in it. Now, we know that in order for the plant to grow, it has to be in the soil. So if the soil doesn't have any life, then how can the plant grow? Yet the soil doesn't display its life unless it's activated by something else. Just to take this one step further, this is why the desert and the image of the desert where nothing grows is the antithesis of sanctity and holiness, because the desert is so, we'll use this metaphoric term, self-consumed, that it won't even share any of its nurturing capacity to give life to the plant, unlike the soil. So even in English, we have a difference between sand and soil. Soil suggests that it's filled with nutrients that produce life, but not unless it's activated by something else. Very much a strong metaphor for all the godliness that is latent within the world, that if we don't activate it, like if I don't plant something in the soil, it won't demonstrate its life-giving ability. Similarly, if we do not activate the godliness that's latent in the material items, that godliness will not spontaneously sprout forth. In contrast to the sand, where you think, well, there's no godliness there because it doesn't even give forth life. And yet, this is where we find the ultimate godliness, that we can bring it out from within the sand. I mean, we talk about the reason or an illustration of the superior godliness in the Beis Hamikdash, even in contrast to the Mishkan, because the Beis Hamikdash is made from stone, and the Mishkan is made from animal skin and wood. So stone, again, does not bespeak any innate godliness. It doesn't grow. It doesn't nurture life. And yet, what is the Beis Hamikdash? It's stone. In contrast to the Mishkan, which again is made from animal skin, certainly more evident of godliness, and wood, which is again from that which blossoms and grows and then produces more trees, etc., etc. So even in the doimei mamish, kamei avonim, like stone, va'afar and rubble, umayim and water, yesh bechinas nefesh, there has to be a divine characteristic within them. They cannot have their own innate existence. So the presumption of my own existence is the ultimate contradiction to the infinity of Hashem. And again, this is what Torah's primary message is. We are not independent of Hashem. So whereas, to take, for example, just a very rough contrast, whereas the secular law says, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not bothering anybody else. But Torah law doesn't have that message. Torah law doesn't say you could eat whatever you want. Torah doesn't say you could wear garments made of any material you want, even if you're not bothering anybody else. Why? Because you don't have your own existence. Our existence is on loan from the infinity of Hashem. And this is that point that is illustrated when we consider that we have no innate existence. It is all about godliness. So here we say, Elohai mistalkais mimena kerega chas v'shalom, were it to be pulled out, even for a moment, God forbid, that is, even if Hashem were to stop giving us our existence, even for a moment. Ha'oisius mi'asara maimarais, the letters of the 10 statements, shebehen nevras ha'aretz, through which Hashem created the heaven, the earth, b'sheshes yemei bereishis, during the 6 days of creation. It would return la'ayin ve'efes mamish, back to its original non-existence, literally, kumoy lifnei shesh yemei bereishis mamish, just like it was before the 6 days of creation. So a whole series of ideas here. This statement that Hashem made, let there be light, let there be the heavens, and so on, is continuous. Hashem is constantly giving that creation because it is not the nature of existence to exist. The natural state is non-existence. And it takes an effort to override that natural state of being and to create this sense of existence. And therefore, were Hashem to interrupt this flow, like turning the electricity off, the light goes out. Now the light bulb would still be there, so the metaphor breaks down. But this is that idea. It would be as if there never was a world. Again, like the idea of a thought. And the same is true with all of the statements of creation, not just the heavenly creations, but the most material that seems like it's going to be there forever. Now, again, to use a series of analogies and so on. If I tell you a story, I say, here's a novel that I'm writing, and it's about a man, and his name is Chaim, and he's 37 years old. How old is Chaim? He's a moment old. I just created him. Even though I give him a history and an identity and a backstory and a family and an education, he doesn't really exist. He only exists insofar as I create him. And then if I get 20 pages into the story and I decide to blend two characters into one or to completely remove a character, then on page 25, that character never exists. And to the reader, that character never exists, even if there's some influence that concept of a character has on the ongoing story. So this makes it very difficult. How we can understand that Hashem can destroy the world, but how can Hashem make the world as if it never existed? So herein we have to again go back and delicately analyze these words. We know that creation, in the sense of turning no thing into something, is the exclusive purview of Hashem. A human being cannot create. What we can do is reorganize. We can transform nature into art. So we take the natural resources and we reconfigure them into something more functional. And that's ultimately our job, right? Hashem placed us in the garden to guard it and to work it. So we can take the natural and transform it into art. So, and as we have talked about before, nature is the starting point. Now, it's true, of course, that someone can be abusive. They can degrade nature. They can harm it. And therefore, we live in a world that has a bias towards honoring nature, because the common perception is, like the concept of shtus, of foolishness, that anything that is not natural means we have harmed nature. And yet, as we know, and you'll recognize this phrase from other areas of Hasidus, there can be a shtus of kedusha. There can be an elevated form of shtus, where we take something and we do something unexpectedly better than what we would have imagined. And as we discuss so often on the personal side, in the Sefer Shel Beinanim, our job is to outpace the inevitable, not just to follow along on the natural trajectory, but to go leaps and bounds and to elevate ourselves to levels beyond it. It's very much what we're living through now. Hashem takes us out of Mitzrayim. That's a miracle. We then try to capture that miracle through an orderly system of counting the Omer, so that when we get to the end, we can have a whole nother miracle, which is Matan Torah, the revelation of the infinity of Hashem. So the two processes are symmetrical. Miracle followed by orderly, followed by greater miracle. Now, in this process with Hashem creating the world, Hashem's constant creation of the world is what allows there to be the very existence of the world. Were Hashem to pull the plug, it would be as if it never was. Why? Because just like a human being can't create, we can't really destroy either. What can we do? We can transform a solid into a vapor. Meaning, we talk about this just as a halachic illustration. On Erev Pesach, we know that we burn the chametz. Why? Because we're not allowed to own any chametz. So we ask the question, well, what do you mean? Now I just got burnt chametz. I have chametz and now it's burnt. So we say, no. When you burn it, you chemically transform it. It's not burnt chametz. It's now ash. It's no longer chametz. And there's an interesting discussion, which is really beyond the scope, but just illustrates the point. We say, well, would it be better to make the chametz, to soak it so much that it becomes inedible? That is, it's still chametz, but it's now lost its capacity to be eaten. Or do you have to burn it? And our rule of thumb, as we're familiar with, is that you have to burn the chametz, because when you burn it, you transform it into ash. You don't really destroy it. We use that term, like we might say a person is very creative, but he's not really creative. He's really artistic. And we say, well, we destroy it. We don't really destroy it. We destroy it from its form. It's no longer chametz. It's now ash. It's no longer wood. It's now vapor. So the conservation of energy, I mean, we're not here for a physics lesson, but it illustrates this idea that only Hashem can create, and only Hashem can truly destroy. Because to destroy something is to completely remove it from ever having existed, not only from existing this point forward. It's curiously one of the miracles of tshuva that allows us to tap into a godly characteristic. What does it mean that Hashem has forgiven me? If I break the window, I fix the window, but I still broke it. I haven't really repaired the essential violence. And we say, no, that's what you can do. You can actually reach back into the past and completely uproot it. And now it's that the window was never broken. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not limited to linear logic the way we think of it. And perhaps there are other examples in science, etc., beyond the scope. But I think it illustrates this idea that Hashem has not only the I don't want to call it the capacity, but it's sort of the natural trajectory. There is an example that we will come across. We've talked about it a little bit earlier, and we'll see it again, that Hasidus uses to talk about this idea. There are two primary metaphors. One is about the rays of the sun, which we've talked about so often. Another is about the imparting of energy onto a physical object. And the simple example, if a person takes a ball or a rock and they throw it up in the air, so if a person is unaware, they look and they say, wow, that's a flying rock. But it's not truly a flying rock. The nature of the rock is not to fly. The nature of the rock is to be on the ground. However, since a person has imparted his energy, and again, we're not here for a physics lesson, but since a person has imparted his energy onto the rock, so now the rock is flying. But of course, that energy is limited. As such, when the energy expires, the rock returns to its natural state, which is to be on the ground. Similarly, Hashem creates the world. As long as Hashem is creating the world has existence. And that existence is real and meaningful, as we talked about, because we are on this assignment, and our capacity to impact godliness and our capacity to fulfill Hashem's purpose and dir b'tachteinim and all of these concepts that we're familiar with. That is all absolutely true and factual and important. And yet it's not innate. It's not, as we would call it, guaranteed. Just to illustrate, unfortunately, one of the lessons we learned after 9/11 is what's really permanent. And what we've come to realize is the only thing that's permanent, or the thing that's most permanent, is the sukkah. Because will there be a sukkah next year? Yes. Will there be a World Trade Center? Unfortunately, and again, we're not hoping for it, but unfortunately, as we see, not necessarily so. So the sukkah, which is the flimsiest, the least stable of structures, will be here next year. But the World Trade Center, it's here as long as it's here. But it's not, quote, guaranteed. Okay, enough metaphors. So back into the point at hand. This is what the Arizal writes. And remember, the Alter Rebbe is very much a Arizal student. I mean, the Arizal lived 150 years before the Alter Rebbe, but within the different schools of thought of Kabbalah, the Alter Rebbe is very much follows the Arizal. Shagam b'doime mamish, even in. I'm sorry, did I read this already? I got myself all. See, I've talked too much, and I lose the place where I'm up to. If I read this already, I apologize. Maybe not. Okay. Even in the, and again, the word doimen, we commonly translate as mineral. Its most literal word meaning would be mute. It doesn't even express itself. It has no sign of connection with anything else. Like stone and sand and water, yesh bechinas nefesh, has a divine spark to it. We read this already. I'm sorry, but v'chayis ruchnius, and a spiritual life force, which is why you may recognize in Hayom Yom there is a quote. I don't remember the day, but it says that when Mashiach will come, a person who is walking on the rocks on the path and not thinking Torah, the rocks will say to him, and they use this word, which apparently in Russian is a very insulting, bulach. It sounds terrible. I don't know what it means. Why are you treading upon me? In other words, the rock says, look, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. My job is to be a rock, and I'm being a rock. And rocks provide a path for people to walk on. So I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Why? Why should I do what I'm supposed to do and be walked on? Because we're part of a team. I serve you serve Hashem. But if you're not serving Hashem, so why should you walk on me? Meaning, when we have this healthy cycle where the mineral serves the vegetable, which serves the animal, which serves the person, which serves Hashem, so now everybody is participatory. But when the mineral is serving the vegetable, because that has no choice, and the vegetable serves the animal, it has no choice, and the animal serves the person because the animal has no choice. And now it comes up to the person who has choice. So if the person doesn't choose to serve Hashem, so then what's the point of this whole exercise? Everything is lined up only to be in the service of Hashem, who then recycles it and sends more nutrients and on and on. So this is that activating force that is in the hands of human beings. The Hainu, this means bechinis is slapshis oisius hadibor miasora maimodas. That is, that Hashem invests, and that's the crucial word here that we're going to talk about. Hashem enclothes, the root of that word is the word for clothing. The letters of speech, we've talked a lot about that in previous chapters, back in like chapter 20 in the Sefer Shal Beinanim, which we'll expound upon in a few moments, just to get the wording down. Of the 10 statements that begin with Bereshis, that's the first of the statements. And then the ones that say, and God said, let there be, and God said, let there be light, and let there be the heavens, and so on. And we talk about, why does God create the world through statements? Or why doesn't God think? Or just, it says, then God created light, which would be a form of action. Or of course, Hashem is not limited, some other mechanism. And we who are categorized as midaber, speakers, on the other end of the spectrum of the mute of domain, the mineral. What is it about speech that is distinctively illustrative of this creative process? Hamachayos, that gives life, umahavois, and gives existence, es hadoimein, to the mineral, liyos yesh mi'ayin, to be something that comes from no thing. And again, remember these words that we've talked about so often. God is not a thing, it's no thing. The Ephes, an absolute zero, which we'll talk about as well. Shulifnei sheshes yimei bereshis, before the 6 days of creation. And then we're going to get to a technical point, but let's back up here for a moment and talk about this idea that even though doimein, and again, doimein is mute, the mineral, that doesn't present any sign of godliness, it doesn't even grow, yet there is a divine force that is constantly nourishing its existence. And if not, it would not be, it would not exist, and would not have ever existed. So why is it that Hashem creates through the power of speech? What is it about this power of speech that is distinctively qualified, I don't know if that's the best word, to be this conveyor of godliness? And again, God could have thought, God could have just created, and so on. So we explain using, and we're allowed to do this, we can use human speech as an insight. And again, when we categorize creation, we've categorized the mineral as mute, the vegetable as blossoming, the animal as living, and the human as speaker. The distinctive ability for speech and the sanctity of speech. And we know how much we talk about you have to enunciate the words of Torah. And about God speaks to us the 10 commandments. Remember, on Shavuos, God speaks to us the 10 commandments. We only get them in writing later, and so on. So some similarities and some dissimilarities between human speech and divine speech, because it's always going to be a shaky metaphor that's going to be imperfect. On the one hand, speech has no stature of its own. Like a person who just babbles on and talks and talks and talks, we find a curiosity just to illustrate this point that when Hashem first comes to Moshe Rabbeinu at the sneh, at the burning bush, Moshe defers or attempts to defer by saying, I'm not a speaker. I can't speak. And yet 20% of Torah, which is the whole book of Devarim, the word Devarim literally means words, from the opening phrase. These are the words which Moshe spoke. And what more, who speaks more in all of Torah than Moshe? Hashem is constantly telling Moshe, this is what you should say to the Jewish people. This is what you should say to the Jewish people. Say this, speak to Paro, and so on. So for a man who says, I can't speak, he's got all the speaking parts belong to Moshe. So what does this mean? So amongst the many interpretations, Moshe is saying, who am I that I should speak to Paro? And Hashem says, because you're speaking my words. Meaning, if a person just talks and talks, that doesn't mean they have anything to say. They just go on and on. So it's not just the power of speaking. It's like a person who's reading a foreign language, or you may be familiar, there's a famous metaphor that Hasidus uses about the person who gets a letter, but he's illiterate, so he has someone else read the letter. And when the person reading the letter reads to the recipient of the letter of some terrible, sad event, the listener passes out, whereas the reader just keeps reading. Why? Because to the reader, it's just words. It doesn't have any meaning. It's like you're reading a foreign language. You don't have, it has no meaning, so it's just words. So there can be empty words, but there also, of course, can be very profound words, because the words are tools. Words are a means of expression. If you don't put anything into it, then the words are meaningless. Concurrently, I can't transfer my thoughts to you. I can't transfer my deepest emotions to you. So if a person is articulate and they can blend their thoughts into their words, they have high fidelity communication from their thoughts and feelings into their words, and then their words can be expressed to a recipient. So the power of the kind word, at the simplest level, the power of nice words, of thoughtful good mornings, communicate something profoundly personal and intimate. So much so, as you recognize from the Haggadah, we talk about the 4 sons, and each one we introduce with Chacham Mahu Omer, Rasha Mahu Omer. The wise son, what he is what he says. Meaning, how are we in a life to distinguish between who's a wise son and who's a wicked son? Mahu Omer, what he says. Meaning, we don't have some sort of smell test that we can sniff out who the bad guy is simply based on his appearance. It's only when the person starts to share something about himself. What is the most profound method of sharing? It is speech, more even than action, even though it's true that an artist who paints a painting and somebody could come along and really know about this artist, like the story about the time they took the Reb Rashab to an art gallery. And he said, this person was blind in one eye, and this person touched his total bittul, and so on. But still, the artist paints the painting and he walks away from it. But the words are forever aligned with the speaker. And therefore, the words are again, Hashem can do whatever he wants, but the words are the perfect method for the communication that's not overwhelming. Thoughts are too abstract. Action is too detached. And therefore, the words are the perfect Goldilocks blend of communication of that which is most profound in a manner that is bite-sized, digestible by the recipient. Now, there are, of course, going to be differences between human speech and divine speech. So divine speech has to be constant. Human speech can carry on, and a person's words can resonate in my ear. I remember things that people say they don't remember themselves that they said it, and so on. But of course, Hashem's speech is constant. It's also one of the distinctive qualities, as we're going to explore here, about the Hebrew letters, which are created by Hashem to be mechanisms for communicating the infinite, unlike other languages, which are essentially consensual. I mean, we all decide to use the word book to describe this. So when I say book, that's what you conjure up. But essentially, we could have decided that this thing is called a table. And if we would have done that, we say table, we'll all come up with this image in our head. But the Hebrew letters are the mechanisms of creation, so that they're the shape of the letters and their meaning, and we'll talk about some of their other they're sort of less literal or more non-literal significances and so on. But again, this means that we have that thing called free choice, because since it's not the overwhelming godliness of thought, it's this more attenuated communication of speech. So it becomes a little bit more narrowed down. As it becomes a little more narrowed down, we become a little bit more in control of being able to manipulate it and so on. And this is what we're going to start to explore here when we jump to the obvious question, that is, well, what about all the things that aren't mentioned explicitly in the 10 statements of creation? So here we go. If you look in the 10 statements, God said, let there be. It doesn't say God said, let there be rocks. So where did rocks come from? Now, this stumbles into another sort of common modern day issue that people sometimes raise. How could Torah have an opinion on air travel or on modern surgical methods? The Talmud didn't know about iPads. So how could they have an opinion on iPads? They didn't know about surgeries. How could they have an opinion about surgeries? So our answer is, well, medicine doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, Steve Jobs didn't invent computers. It's a process that develops, and Torah is continuously in that analysis. It's not like it showed up from nowhere. And the modern inventor didn't create something from nothing. He worked on what the guy before him created. So who created the computer? I don't know. The first guy who came up with the abacus. And where did that come from? It came from some previous state. So it's this constant development. And this is what we discover here within Torah, that even though you won't find the word Eved, stone, Aleph, Beis, Nun, in the 10 statements of creation. So how can we say that God is creating stones? It doesn't say anywhere that God declared, let there be stones. So the Alter Rebbe continues. Alpha PK, nevertheless, Nimshach Chayis le'even, how is there divine life force in the stone? Ayidei Surroufin v'Khilufim oisius hamazgalgalos bereish lamet aleph sha'arim ponim va'achar k'mashikasa b'sefer yitzira ach nishtalshal miyasara ma'imoros v'nimshach mihen tziruf shem even. Now, this is a lot of technical stuff, but we're going to first translate it, then we'll break it down, hopefully, into some bite-sized pieces. And if you have the lessons in Tanya, I made a copy of it because there's a very nice explanation of it that I'll read to you. It's just a few lines. So first, the terminology. Again, the question is, we have declared that God creates everything continuously. And the original creation, something out of nothing, is those 10 statements in the opening chapter of Torah. That means that all existence only exists because it's in Torah. which, as we've talked about in so many different contexts, means that everything has an integral part of creation. No thing exists unless it has the capacity to serve Hashem. And yes, the whole world would be completely not able to achieve its purpose if not for that blade of grass, or you start extending it to that person. Yes, that necessity is, or that factor is an absolute necessity in my life, people that I meet, people I don't meet, et cetera, and the vast and infinite implications of this. But the question is, like a person says, how do I have a place in Torah? Where is my place in all of Torah? Because you see the 10 statements, you see God speaks to Moshe. Even let's go into biblical times. Imagine you are a simple member of, pick any one of the 12 tribes. You're not one of the Nisi and the leaders. You're not even one of the people, Chas v'shalom, from Korach's band of merry men. You're just a regular guy. You're just some person who's a regular person from the tribe. Pick a tribe of your favorite from the tribe of Dan. And you think, what does this have to do with me? God talks to Moshe, God talks to Aaron, God talks to Yeshua, God talks to the warriors. I get the manna, but it doesn't seem like I am integral. And if I wandered off, it wouldn't matter. And yet, we, even more so perhaps, or maybe less so, have this same issue. Just like, how is it possible that God is creating the rock when it doesn't say rock in the Torah? How is it possible that I have an indispensable spot in creation when it doesn't have my name written there? So here the Alter Rebbe brings a Kabbalistic idea, which again, as Hasidus often does, it gives us a pragmatic application of that concept. So we talked about a couple of things. One is what is called Surroufin. Surroufin is the capacity to rearrange letters. So a simple example, the first two letters of the Aleph Beis, Av is father. You rearrange them, Beis, Aleph, Boy is come. So we see that the letters are energy components, and you rearrange them. Now, again, this isn't a perfect analogy because what I'm about to say are only symbols, but when we talk about the chemical symbols, so we all remember from high school, H2O is water, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Now, again, if I swap out the letter and I make it C2O, 2 points carbon, 1 point oxygen, that's just really a little bit of a game because we just decided that C represents carbon and H represents hydrogen. But in Hashem's creation, the actual letters change the very character of the product. They're not just symbols. Then we have what is called Khilufim. Khilufim is an exchange of letters. Now, there's many systems of this, and it sometimes feels like it's willy-nilly. And it's curious that in Chabad, we are very particular. The Rebbe has a sikha where he points this out. We're very cautious about sort of making up our own gematrias. And we've all been to those Sheva brachas or speeches where the guy starts making up a gematria about the name of the chassid and the name of the, okay, it's fine. It's potentially harmless, but it's potentially harmful because it seems to almost make half a joke out of the whole thing. And we got to be very careful about that. But there is one process of many that's referred to as at bash gar, which is, if you think about, just imagine the letters, it's the first letter of the Aleph Beis is Aleph. The last letter is Taf. Beis, second letter, Shin, second to last, Gimel, Resh. And this goes all the way down the line. And it becomes a method through which we can see an interplay between them. We can see a connection between them. It's perhaps most analogous to relatives. I'll give you a halachic example. We know that 2 relatives are not allowed to be witnesses on a document or on at a wedding and so on. For whatever reason, even Moshe and Aaron, not because we think that they're liars, but they're brothers, they're disqualified. So how related? Everyone's related. If we go back far enough, everyone's related. but my relationship with my brother is a little more obvious than my relationship with my cousin, than with my second cousin, et cetera, et cetera. Even though, right, you could go far, but if you go far back, far enough, you'll find a common ancestor. We know about this biologically and so on, that there is going to be a biological commonality through this tracing back of all of this relationship. And then, of course, there's the gematrias that people are familiar with, which again, sometimes gets abused and turns into something that seems almost silly. And if you squint hard enough, you can see anything you like, but there is actually a system to it. You know, the old statement, torture numbers and they'll say anything you want. Excuse me. But there is a process through which the numerical values give us an insight. The fact that two words have a similar numerical value means that there's a little bit more of an obvious relationship between them. Ultimately, all words are related, but there's a little bit more of an awareness of that relationship between two words that have the same gematria than words that don't. But we're pretty cautious, especially in Chabad, about not just sort of making this stuff up. Now, it mentions that there are 231 combinations. What is this a reference to? So in the lessons in Tanya, it quotes, and if you have it there, I copied it, that in the Sefer HaPardes Shaar Hayichud in chapter 5, there are 22 letters of the Aleph Beis. If you make two-letter combinations of them, Aleph Beis, Beis Aleph, Aleph Gimel, Gimel Aleph, et cetera, you'll get a total of 462 combinations. Half, of course, are the exact reverse of each other, Aleph Beis, Beis Aleph. So if you take them, you break it down, you're going to get 231 two-letter combinations in direct order and the same number in the reverse order. Aleph Beis, Aleph Gimel, Aleph Dalet, Beis Gimel, Beis Dalet, Beis Hey, Gimel Dalet, et cetera, all the way down the line. Well, you do the math, you get 231. So again, there isn't really an infinite number of creations. There is only a finite number of creations, right? We may never be able to, but there is a finite number of blades of grass. There is a finite number of species of apples and of animals, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a process, and all of that manifests itself down. Just like, right, we can trace the modern computer back to that original method of adding and so on. It doesn't come from nowhere. It feels that way because we were unaware of it. It wasn't something that we had in our homes. It was some bizarre remote idea that then became popularized, and now we can't live without it. But it didn't literally come from nowhere. And this is how halacha is developed in medical issues and so on. And as it becomes, we start to dig into Torah, say, oh, look, yes. And stories that seem completely bizarre and irrelevant, and why do they even talk about this? Oh, now all of a sudden we start to see where there is something hidden that we never developed. When I say hidden, I mean it wasn't something that we had mined and discovered. So it all originates, though, from that innate creation. Prior to that, there was no existence. So what was going on the day before God created the world? It's a trick question. There was no day before. V'hu chayusa shel Evan, and that's what is giving life force to Evan, the stone, because the letters Aleph, Beis, and Nun, that is all 22 letters of the Aleph Beis, are contained within the statements of creation. And once those energies are out there, they are infinitely given to that opportunity. There is a story, it's actually somewhat relevant to Shavuos, that Moshe Rabbeinu, you've probably read his book, came to Hashem years after he had passed, and he said, I want to go down into the world and see what has happened with my Torah. So they sent him down, so Hashem sends him down to the class of Rabbi Akiva, also a timely reference. He gets down to the class of Rabbi Akiva, and he is seated in the 7th row. And the way it worked there was that the best students were seated in the front row and further back. And there's actually a dispute whether there's the 7th row or the 9th row. So now, of course, everyone would be in therapy because he didn't sit in the front row. But at that time, I guess they didn't have this issue. And Moshe Rabbeinu, who, graduated first in his class, could not follow he couldn't follow the lecture. It was and he was like despondent until they got to a question, and Rabbi Akiva said, well, this is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is a law that God gave to Moshe at Sinai. End of story. So Moshe was appeased. So the Rebbe asked, the obvious question. We have a statement that everything that every student is ever going to be able to innovate came to Moshe at Sinai. So what do you mean Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't follow it? In fact, it's kind of like what we call a left-handed compliment, that if somebody says something in Torah study that seems bizarre, so a sarcastic person, nobody here, of course, would say to that person, wow, that's so brilliant, even Moshe Rabbeinu didn't think of it. In other words, it must be ridiculous. So you say, well, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't think of it. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu think of it? Because it doesn't make any sense. So how is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu should not be able to follow a lesson from Rabbi Akiva? So the Rebbe explains that what this means, and why is he appeased? Why? Because Rabbi Akiva gave a shout out to Moshe and said, oh, it's a law that Hashem gave to Moshe. Oh, I feel better now. Why Moshe needed an ego stroke? He's the humblest of all people. So the Rebbe explains that what this means is that Hashem gave us all of the information and all of the tools, like we say in the davening every morning, the 13 mechanisms for Torah deduction, to extrapolate all, and mine, maybe better, all of the depth that is to be found in the words of Torah. And every generation, we mine it out more and more. So if Pythagorean came along, supposed to be impressed, I know what that is, and he saw how we use a squared plus b squared equals c squared, he might say, well, I didn't think of that, right? He didn't think of the application. He came up with the theorem because he lisped, and he didn't anticipate every single application, or the Wright brothers, or Einstein, or medical, whatever it may be. But what's the essential basis is that it was all given to Moshe at Sinai. Before that, it doesn't exist. So we put in the rules, and within the rules, we can create this whole world. People, I'm not an author, but people who write stories tell the same thing. They create characters, and then all of a sudden the characters, who are completely fictional, start to dictate to the author their life story. So this is that process that starts to be fleshed out. All creations. Again, we're only talking about their names in the holy language, not to be confused with modern Hebrew, with fax machine and taking English words and putting an Israeli accent on them to give them meaning. Meaning, what is their real identity? These are those letters, those spoken words that come from the 10 essential statements that Hashem put into the world. That's not within our capacity. That Hashem puts into the world. Then we take them and Khilufim, through these different mechanisms of switching them around. Vitumuras oisis, and the shapes of the letter, like we talk about, the aleph is a yud above and a yud below. You may recognize this, and the vav in between. So Hashem creates the rules, the parameters, these energies, and then we flesh them out and develop them and give them depth and contour and meaning and significance. Through these 231 gates that we talked about before, how we got that number 231, until it comes and creates this particular pencil. To give it that life force, we take the nature and we turn nature into art. That is our assignment, to turn nature into art. Why? Because these creations, their godliness is so muted that we're not overwhelmed by it. Because were the godliness to come directly into pencil, we wouldn't be able to see it, as a pencil would be so overwhelming, as we are properly awed by the great works of nature. the Grand Canyon, mountains, whatever it may be, when a person is awed by that, which is appropriate, and that's when we have a bracha that we say, and how great are God's words, and so on, because every once in a while, whether it's thunder and lightning and so on, we get awed. We know about this. We have spaceships and so on, but if it rains, we're delaying the launch. So we are awed by the nature, but our job is not just to be in awe of nature, but to transform nature into art. Now, it's true, we can also manipulate nature and turn it into something less than its innate value. That's where that free choice thing comes in. Because the godliness that is in, again, these tremendous acts of nature, one of the reasons why we make a bracha, so that we're not awed by the lightning. We're awed by Hashem, who sends the lightning, or the Grand Canyon, or whatever it is. It's far greater than anything individuated, which is why there's a great virtue in being simply awed by it. And unless it trickles down to us. And again, just to use that analogy, the concept of the computer was something completely overwhelming. And what Steve Jobs did is he made it accessible to the ordinary person. He took something that was frightening and overwhelming, and it was only for people who were extraordinarily devoted to its study, and made it available to everybody. Mitzvahs on the spot for people on the go. I mean, very much this idea to bring the infinity of Hashem to the ordinary individual. If you bring them the overwhelming, it's like that Chabad thing. Hi, I'm mildly interested in Jewish life. Okay, we'll be over your house with a blowtorch, sign your kids up for camp. Here's Rabbeinu. I just said I was mildly interested. Okay. And we're moving you to Crown Heights. And so, it's like a little slow down. Again, even reducing this enormity, this infinity down to numbers, we've taken it down to something as tangible and as rigid as numbers. Till it can be compressed and invested and create a particular creation. That's the infinity of Hashem. The infinity is more profoundly illustrated in the ordinary than in the extraordinary. So we're awed, and I'm not diminishing it, by lightning and thunder and oceans and so forth, should be. We should similarly be awed. Imagine if we could have that same sense by the pencil. We talk about that on Sukkot. The esrog represents the scholar who's also righteous and so on. But which of the four species gets its own special day? The willow that we beat on the floor, because we need to be as impressed with the godliness of the least impressive. It doesn't have an aroma, and it doesn't produce a fruit, as we always talk about. And this is its name as is defined in Lashon Kodesh. I even hesitate to just use the word Hebrew, but it's Lashon Kodesh, it's the holy language. Which is itself almost an anomaly. How could something holy be capturable in words? God is the Holy One, and He's connected. That's the greatest, like we call it Chiddush, the greatest gift of godliness is that His infinity can be invested within the ordinary. It becomes, and this is what God has done, He has embedded Himself in these particular letters. And we are spending 82 years extrapolating and unpacking the godliness that is contained within them. Livroya yesh miyayin, to create something from no thing, and to give it life, la'olam, to the world, diaraisa, through Torah, which is the mechanism through which we unpack it. When all else fails, read the instructions. So this becomes our tool to open up the infinite godliness that is to be found in the finite creations, because Torah is one with Hashem. So the world has to, so to speak, Torah has to precede the world, like we say, the Torah and the Jewish people. That is, the instructions and the actors precede the creation. You don't create a product and then try to figure out what it's good for. You first identify what the person who needs it, who's going to need this object. Then you identify what they're going to need it for. Then you start the production. So Torah, which is how to use this product, and the people, the Jewish people, who are the users of this product, predate the product. And then when you get a product, boom, now you're ready to, you have a full cycle together. All right, to be continued. All right, have a good week, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
This is my favorite. This is my favorite thing. I love this piece of Tanya.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. Bye-bye.